What if even the powerful option of something like batch Apex isn't enough? What if there is just way too much Apex on the platform, such that it is difficult to maintain? What if we need to make object transactions less heavy? There may be times when building solutions off-platform that use Salesforce data make a lot of sense. When it comes to choosing logic, please note that I'm mostly approaching this topic from the standpoint of writing code and running it off-platform. Looking into third-party tools is another story, of course. How do you know when you need to build logic off-platform at all? The first step goes back to the fundamentals I discussed in the previous module. Analyze and profile existing object transactions. Find the largest bottlenecks. Also, it's not here on the slide, but sometimes bottlenecks can come in the form of components or code that's no longer relevant to the organization. Sometimes bottlenecks involve logic or automation that no longer benefit anyone, and it makes a lot of sense to start with deprecating old functionality. That alone is enough to free up the room. In other words, just the act of investigating and identifying old cruft, inefficient or unoptimized automation is enough for easy wins on performance. Start there. Be thorough. Next, determine what is needed immediately or what can be processed synchronously versus what can be offset or done behind the scenes from the user's eyes, for example. What can be done asynchronously or after the immediate processing of transactions? Or, in the case of Lightning components or Visualforce pages, what can be done after the click of a button instead of directly at the time of that button click? For asynchronous activity, determine what can be parallelized. Sometimes it may be possible to break work up into multiple future calls or a series of queuable jobs, and those things run in parallel instead of having to go off-platform. At the end, though, it may be inevitable. It may be that Salesforce just can't do what you need it to do. Okay, so at last, you may build off-platform. Then you need to be aware of the API limits. Each org only has a certain number of allowed API calls per rolling 24-hour period. Each SOQL query, each DML operation, counts as a hit against these API calls. And these calls can add up quickly. Prioritize what leaves the platform due to these API costs, as well as the overall cost of implementation. It is important to weigh these against each other in making a decision. And consider the differences between the APIs. When I'm talking about those limits per rolling 24-hour period, I'm mostly talking about the REST API, but you might also be doing work with the Streaming API, or the Bulk API, for instance. And these have different limits than is typical with the REST API. Of course, they are used for different purposes too. We won't be covering how to use these different APIs in this course, as they don't pertain to Apex or the governor limits on object transactions. But they are useful, and by the end of your journey in development, it's likely you'll find great use in knowing about these APIs. Now, let's take a look at a couple examples with asynchronous Apex in the next clip.